Good morning, everyone. Sorry for starting late, but these things happen. Welcome to the session on gender and economic growth. I think these are two topics that are close to all our hearts. There's consensus that higher economic engagement would benefit women, their families, and the economy as a whole. All of us would agree, however, that women face constraints in further engaging in the economy. This includes constraints at the extensive margin, resulting in low labor force participation. Among those working or owning a business, they also have less access to good jobs or capital or development opportunities. Some can only work part-time, even though maybe they want to work more. So these challenges differ by country and are driven by many factors. The solutions are also context-specific. So we will discuss these challenges, solutions with 4 panelists representing academia, government, think tank. As with other sessions, we hope to provide policy recommendations for G7 countries and partners, highlighting areas where greater collaboration between G7 and G20 would be essential. So before we go, we'll introduce the panelists alphabetically. Bina Agarwal, thank you for joining us very early morning from India. She's the professor of development economics and environment at the University of Manchester. Among her stellar accomplishments, you can see her full bio. To me, the most impressive one is the civil society campaign that successfully made India's Hindu inheritance law gender equal. So I think that's an amazing accomplishment. The second speaker is Tomoko Hayashi, who is the vice president at the Economic and Social Research Institute, Cabinet Office of Japan. I just realized yesterday that the Cabinet Office is the one that calculates Japan's GDP. So yeah, very important, among other things. The third panelist here is Elizabeth King. If you don't know Elizabeth King, it's your own fault, nobody else's fault. So Beth is non-resident fellow, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She was the World Bank's Global Director for Education and acting Vice President for Human Development. And she recently published a book on human capital and gender inequality in middle-income countries. Last but not least, Charity Moore also joining us online. So for Charity, it's late at night. So thank you. She's Director for South Asia Economics Research at Yale University's Macmillan Center. She works on issues related to how policy and culture interact to enable or constrain women's economic engagement. So I will first start with just asking the panelists to mention what they think from their research and their deep experience on the main challenges, constraints facing women's economic engagement. As I mentioned, it's different by different countries. So, it'd be great to hear their insights. I will start with Hayashi-san for about 5 minutes, and then we go to the other panelists. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Daniel. Can I have my slide, please? Yes. Thank you. So I'll talk about gender and growth and empowerment of women in the context of Japan. The Japanese economy has seen an increase in employed people since Abenomics started in 2013, despite continuous decline of working age population. Why it happened? Because the labor participation rates of women and elderly got higher because of economic recovery, labor shortage, and providing more child care facilities. Before Abenomics, contribution of labor input to growth had been negative because of decline in working age population. So as the textbook tells us, the economic growth is a function of labor and capital input and TFP. But during Abenomics, the contribution rate of labor to growth turned to be positive because of increase in women labor participation. The other possible channel of contribution to the growth is productivity led by innovation through diversity. Various empirical studies have confirmed that greater diversity in decision-making produces a more innovation-friendly environment that boosts corporate profit. Having said that, total factor productivity growth in Japan remained unsatisfactory. That means that while women's labor has increased in terms of quantity and contributed to economic growth, we are not yet at the point of a quantitative contribution through diversity-driven innovation. There's further challenge. The gender issue involves in Japan two Ds. One is diversity, the other D is dual labor market. In Japan, more than half of female employees are non-regular workers. There are wage gaps between types of employment, and the older the employees get, the wider those gaps become. The government introduced the principle of equal pay for equal work into the law, but there is still a long way to go before the dual labor market is completely eliminated. We also see gender pay gap within regular workers. Even women with university degree working as regular worker earn 20% less than men with the same qualification, and the level of wage is closer to that of high school graduates of men. The government decided to change this situation, and now firms are required to disclose their gender pay gap from this year. The labor market reality and social security system which discourage women from working result in the fact that 60% of married women with university degree do not work or earn less than 2 million yen annually, just slightly above the poverty line in Japan. That is a waste of resources. I mean, waste of human resources and waste of education cost. As this data shows, Japan's economic potential could be unleashed by women working to the full extent of their knowledge and ability. I'd like to mention further challenges. There are three main factors that hinder women's empowerment: mindset, institutions, and practices in workplace and labor market, which became entrenched during Japan's post-war period of rapid economic growth in the 20th century. So men do paid work, and women do unpaid work at home. And this triangle is really strong, and it has led to a vicious cycle of gender inequality, and that led to lack of diversity and low productivity with less innovation. Wow. There are various factors of this stark difference between Japan and the United States. And of course, various factors, but I'm sure one of these factors is diversity. So it's time to change for enhancing women's economic empowerment and also economic dynamism of innovation through diversity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Hayashi-san. So I want to move on to a charity who's done a lot of research on India and South Asia in general. So Charity, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Daniel, and I want to thank you and the ADBI and the T7 organizers for including me in this wonderful event. I think since you asked us to speak a little bit about the challenges facing women's economic engagement, both on the extensive margin and the intensive margin, what I thought I would do is zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about what we have traditionally thought to be the story of women's economic engagement as countries develop, and then point out what I think are two puzzles that exist right now, and suggest that maybe we should be challenging some of the accepted narratives around women's economic engagement. I think probably many of us in the room, if you know anything about gender and women's labor force participation, there's kind of this commonly accepted narrative, which is that at very low levels of economic development and at very high levels of economic development, women tend to be working in the labor force. But as countries move out of low income status and move into kind of middle income status, women tend to drop out of the labor force. And so these are the countries that tend to have the lowest female labor force participation. And the rationale behind this story is very reasonable. It's that women were working in agriculture when their countries were at very low levels of income and development. And as households are able to earn more income through one income earner, women decide that they want to opt out of agriculture. They're not good jobs for them to go into. And so instead they invest more in their households. Maybe they take on more leisure time, this sort of thing. And as time goes on, women continue to gain and grow in their levels of education, and fertility declines in these countries. And eventually, as countries continue to grow, there are service sector jobs that come up and are very appealing to women. And so as a result, as these countries' incomes grow again, we see this U shape where women had dropped out of the labor force, and now, at least in a cross-country perspective, they're actually opting back into the labor force again. And that's why we see at higher levels of development that women are engaging more in the labor force. So this was something that Claudia Golden and many other people have talked about over the years. And there is a cross-country U-shape that correlates with women's economic participation in their country's levels of development. But I'd like to just point out kind of two facts that I think should make us pause and question whether this narrative really should be the one that we're using to kind of define and understand women's economic participation. And one relates to high-income countries, and then one relates to low-income countries, in India in particular, where I do a lot of work. And for high-income countries, we see things that are quite different than they were in the past. As fertility rates have declined in high-income countries, the relationship between women's labor supply and their fertility is different than what it used to be. Now in these high-income countries where women are working more, they actually have higher levels of fertility. And in countries where women tend to be working less, in these high-income countries, they actually have lower levels of fertility. So that suggests that more than just kind of economic factors are at play in determining whether women decide to opt into the labor force. And I think a lot of people talk about things like compatibility of women's careers and their family goals are a driver of both fertility, but also job decisions as well. So there are lots of different policies, but also norms and culture that might be playing a role in whether women are opting into the labor force in these high income settings. The other, kind of puzzle that doesn't quite line up with some of the, the basic narrative that's been pretty commonly accepted over the years really is India's case. And the case of India is puzzling because India has grown in terms of GDP quite quickly over the past 20, 30 years. And even as it's grown economically, we've not seen women coming into the labor force in new ways like we might expect them to do. And in fact, we've seen kind of quite massive and precipitous declines in rural women's labor force participation in particular. And, I think a lot of people say, well, a lot of this relates to cultural norms that keep women out of work and that make them, want to stay home, or that, their household members are kind of encouraging them to stay home and not to go out for jobs. I would posit there's more to the story than just norms and labor supply, but it actually relates to the type of growth that we see now that, in a country like India, even though GDP per capita is growing quite quickly as a whole over the past 20 to 30 years, we're seeing a lot of jobless growth, right? And so rather than having service sector jobs that women can opt into, there are just no jobs available for women, particularly those in rural areas. So I guess I kind of pointed out, the generally accepted narrative and, pointing to these two puzzles, this low fertility and low female labor force participation in high income countries, and then India's very quick decline in rural female labor force participation, and the fact that, a lot of times it's norms are kind of pointed to as, the main reason driving this, but I'd at least like to challenge that a little bit and say, maybe there's more to the story than just norms and, household preferences and that sort of thing. So, I'd leave you with the idea that maybe some of the underlying factors that have really determined how, women's economic engagement works in the past may not actually be the ones, or they may be working a little bit differently than how we've understood them to work for, say, the past 50 or 100 years. And I think these are important questions that we really need to grapple with to understand if we should really change the way that we're talking about and thinking about, women's economic engagement as countries develop. I'll stop there. Thanks, Daniel.
Great, thanks a lot, Charity. Thanks for debunking tightly held opinions or facts or previous studies. So moving on, so Bina, you've done a lot of research, in India about women agriculture and the rural sector. So please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks to ADBI for this invitation. What I have to say dovetails very well with what Charity has said. So I'll take this forward in a different direction and make 3 points. First, I'd like to emphasize that women are already deeply engaged with the economy, but they're not fully visible in the data and so on, and they're not able to achieve their full potential for many reasons, including demand, lack of jobs, as Charity has said. But women's labor force participation is only one indicator of their economic contribution to the economy. In developing economies, for instance, most women are farmers and self-employed workers in the informal sector. And the kind of transition we may have expected has not happened. So for instance, in India, some 90% of women workers are in the informal sector. And many work on family-owned enterprises. So their contributions are poorly captured in data on labor force participation rates. Moreover, as farmers and self-employed workers, women's contribution to the economy depends greatly on their access to productive assets. In agriculture, the most important asset is land, followed by complementary inputs. Yet globally, there is vast gender inequality in land ownership. So for example, less than a third of landowners in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America are women. And these figures are as low as 11% in Brazil, 10% in Nigeria, 14% in India. Now, if we add to that there are inequalities in access to irrigation, fertilizers, credit, technology, and markets, we have a story of very low potential realization. Now, some years ago, FAO had made estimates that if women farmers in developing countries had the same access to land and inputs as men do, they could increase their farm yields by 20 to 30% and raise the country's total agricultural output by 2.5 to 4%, depending on country. And what this suggests is that there is a direct link between reducing inequality in land ownership and the country's economic growth. Now, these efficiency gains matter greatly, given the very high proportion of women in agriculture in the global south. And what we're seeing is also in many countries, especially in Southeast Asia, is an emerging feminization of agriculture. as more men move to non-farm jobs, which leaves, of course, a growing proportion of women as de facto managers of farms. So in fact, access to productive assets and female employment options are very closely linked. Now, if we broaden the assets to include financial assets, we find a large gender gap even in developed countries such as UK, USA, and Europe. In fact, gender inequality in job options, in wages and earnings, as Tomoko also mentioned, translates into gender gaps in pension incomes, in savings, and in wealth accumulation. And the higher up you go in the earnings ladder, the more the gender gap in wealth. So according to the World Economic Forum report of last year, in senior leadership roles, the gap is as high as 38%. So this is the first point about the importance of productive assets to enhance women's potential economically in any country. The second is that reducing gender inequality in assets is important not just instrumentally for GDP growth, but especially for enhancing people's well-being. So there is substantial global evidence that the ownership of productive assets greatly enhances women's own economic and social well-being. It reduces their risk of poverty, and it significantly improves child survival, health, and education. So reducing the gender asset gap will also help achieve many SDGs. Some of these directly, such as SDGs 5, 1, 2, and 10, which is gender inequality, poverty, hunger, and inequality in general. And some indirectly, such as SDGs for decent work, for education, and health. Now, many factors, of course, underlie gender inequality in economic assets, such as unequal inheritance laws, low awareness of legal rights, social norms, parental son preference when they're bequeathing their wealth, and women's own lifetime earnings due to labor market inequalities. In other words, we have interlinked effects with inequalities in the labor market, translating to inequalities in assets and wealth. And there are also intergenerational effects insofar as the mother's lack of assets limits their daughter's educational outcomes. And third, and very briefly, the question, of course, is how do we reduce gender inequalities in assets? Now, if we depend mainly on family inheritances, it does not appear to pay much dividend. So we need to explore alternative routes. And two important sources of land and assets are the state and markets. Also, I believe we need to think outside the box. We need to go beyond individual ownership to consider group ownership and access of assets. So for instance, in India, some years ago, in the government of Andhra Pradesh instituted a loan-cum-grant scheme under which poor women could purchase land in groups of 10 and then register equal-sized plots individually. And in Kerala today, poor women have been accessing land in groups by leasing in jointly and pooling labor and capital to cultivate together, sharing costs and benefits. There are 68,000 group farms involving over 300,000 women in Kerala alone. And my research shows that group farms outperform individual family farms, both in productivity and profits. So I would say these are very important examples of thinking outside the box. And I look forward to further discussion on these points. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bina. So last but not least, Beth, please provide your insights on this topic.
Thank you, Daniel. First of all, when I saw this session, Gender and Growth, for this T7 summit, I was thinking, why do we have such a session? Is it because the T7 Japan is trying to be politically correct? Is that the reason? I mean, we've been discussing peace and security. We've been discussing climate change and what we can do to mitigate and adapt to climate change that we expect to be coming, and possibly just making life hard for so many people, and making and threatening our economies, threatening our societies, probably will bring more conflict, etc. So what's gender got to do with it? What do girls and women have to do with the topics we were discussing this yesterday all day and this morning? So that was I hope that my co-panelists have already talked about how important gender inequality, or actually equality, can be towards growth. Maybe we can convince you about that, and that women deserve to be also in the labor force, in the labor market, and to be rewarded for the human capital that they have in an as equal a way as possible. So equal wages for equal work. So my three co-panelists have talked to you about that. I want to say just a few more things. One is that there are several studies by economists, so economists are on board on this agenda. It isn't just about social scientists who want to be politically correct, or social scientists in the gender studies. This is actually a topic that macro growth economists are taking on. So let me add to a couple of points that my co-panelists have made. One is that recently studied just before the pandemic have shown that underrepresentation of women in high-paying jobs results in a loss of 17% of income per capita. 2/3 of this is due to gender differences in labor force participation. And I want to say a little bit more about that in a while. And 1/3 is due to women not being able to get some jobs. They're just blocked from some jobs. That's a study across the world, but there are also studies in regions. For example, in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, due to inequality in wages, growth goes down by 14%, in Latin American countries by 9.4%. Another take on this is that in the US, aggregate GDP per capita would increase by 20 to 40% if gender equality were achieved in high-skilled occupation. And it's important to actually think about the high-skilled occupation, especially managerial talent. There have been studies that show that reallocation of capital and talent and using talent and capital to the best use, that is without gender inequality, would increase the GDP in the US by 3.8% in aggregate terms. So these are not small numbers. In India, a study just after the pandemic by Chiplunkar and Goldberg shows that there are large barriers to women-run firms in terms of capital, and that it's not just women who will benefit from them having high-paying jobs. Men's wages will also increase by 15%. And that's because of this reallocation of talent and capital will make firms more productive. So everybody benefits from that. So I want to say this is not just about being politically correct. It's actually thinking about the economy as a whole. And we know that that's something that's important. I talked about how important it is, or my co-panelists talked about how important it is to invest in human capital. And indeed, the developing world and middle-income countries have succeeded in increasing the human capital in girls and in women. I call that vertical progress. So yay for our SDGs in terms of education. But we have to think about two other things that's happening. One is horizontal segregation. And what it is that women and men are going to different fields of specialization. There are more women now who are going to STEM areas, science, technology, engineering, and math, but it's sort of on the softer side and the lower paying side of the STEM areas. And in particular, women are not keeping up with the education in smart technologies, in ICT. And they will pay for that. We will pay for that if we're not in those fields. Why? Because the nature of jobs is changing. There's a decline in routine jobs and an increase in non-routine analytical, non-routine high decision-making jobs. And we, women, have to be prepared for those kinds of jobs, the jobs in the future. So horizontal segregation also means horizontal segregation in terms of high-paying occupations. A third phenomenon is the leaky pipelines. And actually, my co-panelists have referred to that. What do we mean by leaky pipelines? Well, we have vertical progress in terms of education, and women, by the way, are enrolling and completing tertiary education more than men in many countries, and that's kind of surprising many people. But the leaky pipeline means that the women who are actually, let's say they're getting the same degrees as the men, tend to not use those degrees. And they don't use those degrees because of a phenomenon that economists call adverse selection. And it pertains to women self-selecting jobs that are compatible with their family responsibilities and their caregiving responsibilities. That's one of the reasons why we have leaky pipelines. And the other, of course, is discrimination. Glass walls, meaning to say they can't get certain jobs, and glass ceilings. So they can't go, they don't get the promotion or the higher jobs. So those are the reasons why, although we've been seeing progress in terms of education, we don't see equality in wages or in occupations.
Okay. Great, thanks very much, Beth. So for the second round, we talked about the challenges facing women in engaging more in the economy, and it's different by different contexts and different situations. So I want the panelists to spend some time talking about solutions. What has worked, what has not worked so far, what are the supporting factors that allow some solutions to be successful, and also how this links then to the point of T7, that is to provide G7 countries and also a partnership between G7 and G20 on what to do next to improve women's economic engagement. So I'd like maybe Hayashi-san to start first, and then we go to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So I'd like to respond to 2 points that my co-panelists argued and raised. And the first one is, as Charity mentioned, the positive correlation of labor participation rates of women and birth rates in developed countries. That is possible, but on the other hand, I think these are just a correlation, not causality. And perhaps there is a kind of the third factor to explain both birth rates and women's participation rates. And one of the third factors is fathers' involvement in child care. So looking at the say division of work at home, like about unpaid work in Japan between men and women, women always do almost all the work of child care, and men don't. And this kind of disparity of work of unpaid work at home is one of the reasons of low birth rate in Japan. And I'd like to propose to promote further child care leave of men, fathers. And actually, in the central government in Japan, we pushed that. And recently, around 50% of fathers took child care leave, and more than 1 month. And it is really fruitful for the change of mindset and norm, which were entrenched from the rapid economic growth period in the last century, and really great impact on the mindset and atmosphere of the workplace. So that's one thing I'd like to mention. The other issue that is what Elizabeth mentioned, that is, skill and technology and women's specialization of work. And recently, I'm very much worrying about the impact of recent technological advancement and its impact on the labor market, in particular, gender disparity. So a few years ago, we saw recession caused by COVID-19. So the COVID-19 had disproportionate impact on men and women in terms of work, because a lot of women worked for hospitality industries like hotels and restaurants, and they lost job. So COVID-19 shock is sometimes called recession rather than recession. And this time, say AI, chat, GPT might replace your work, even if your work is very, very decent. And the AI and digitalization might change completely the picture of labor market and perhaps disproportionate impact on gender issue and women's work. So that's really important to respond by G7 countries. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Shisan. So, Charity, in your work, both in developing and developed countries, what do you see that things that have been successful in changing these status quo in terms of women and economic engagement?
Yeah, I think in the work that I've done in India, we've seen some really interesting and positive and promising results just by simply making small policy changes that ensure that women are treated as individuals. And the place I'm coming from is, I've worked on a study looking at a large government workfare program that was essentially, supposed to be paying people individual wages for days that they work on the program. And rather than doing that, they had, kind of this gender bias built in which when women worked for the program, their husbands were paid on their behalf, right? And so we ran a randomized control trial where we actually opened bank accounts for women, trained them how to use the accounts, and then made sure that if they were going to work, they would actually receive their wages directly. And we didn't just see that the women worked more for the workfare program, which we were expecting to see, but we also saw that these women went out and worked more in the private sector. As we explored this further, what became apparent was that these women had actually wanted to work outside the home, and their husbands had been not allowing them to work outside the home because it was perceived as a source of shame or stigma, because these husbands thought that the community would judge them as poor providers if their wives were actually going out and working. But the women actually wanted to work all along. And, I think one of the most interesting and promising results of the study was that we also saw that a few years later, going back to these women and to their husbands, asking them about, gender norms around women in work. And we found that not only were the women, adhering to more or less restrictive views related to women in work, but their husbands, also had slightly more lenient views as well. So, this suggested to us that policy can actually, relatively quickly change both the economic environment, but also some of those norms that we think are kind of sticky and take a long time to change and evolve. If I could just say one other thing related to, what are potential wins as we talk about gender. I think Beth made some really good points related to the fact that in many cases, we're seeing women actually surpass men's achievement levels when we're talking about things like levels of tertiary education around the world. In fact, for those of us who care about gender, I think a lot of times we come from a feminist perspective, but I think gender issues are human issues. And, the G7 countries need to also grapple with the fact that men are falling behind in some ways, not at the very highest levels. Women there are still huge gender gaps that we need to address where women are behind men. But, when it comes to lower income or lower education populations, men are falling behind in a lot of ways. And this is something that we really need to see as something on the horizon that needs to be dealt with. So any sort of gender-related policy, something that's going to promote women's well-being, we know from an economic efficiency perspective, and again, this is what Beth was saying and others were alluding to, it's much more efficient to bring women into the economy. Your economy will grow faster. You'll have better people at the table if you're more equitable and allow everyone a seat there, right? But many times, especially because the way that the labor market is changing, men may feel that they're individually losing out as women are gaining, right? And it's, kind of an analogous situation to, some of the trade issues that we've seen in the United States. Trade became more efficient when, we implemented NAFTA, but there have been a lot of workers that have been dislocated. And, after not dealing with this as well as we should have in the United States, we've seen some real consequences in both economically, but also politically and socially. And some very interesting data from the World Values Survey across the world suggests that men are more likely than women to agree that when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. But beyond that, if we look at this gradient of men reporting that they had scarcity within their household, those that experienced that scarcity or said that they were struggling with income are much more likely to agree that women should not have access to that job. So they're adhering more strictly to these gender norms when they are feeling a sense of loss or like they're struggling in the labor market in the first place. So I think we just need to think a little bit about winners and losers at the individual level, and the fact that people often perceive these gender issues to be a zero-sum game. And the response then is, how can the state actually support everyone, not just women, not just men, but everyone, so that people are not feeling dislocated and there's a robust social safety net for them? And how can policies also put men, be more inclusive to men in households in terms of providing paternity leave and illustrating the importance of men in households, in child rearing, in household care and domestic duties, all these types of things, so that we bring more men into the center of the household through policy and more women into the labor force, but largely take care of everyone the best that we can.
Great, thanks very much, Charity. Bina, so Charity talks a little bit about small policies, but you've done some work that has actually changed big policies, like your work on the inheritance law, for example. And some of these sort of macro level things are sometimes biased against women. In Indonesia, for example, the tax system, I think, if a female worker has a husband, then it's sort of by default they have to connect to their husband's tax system, and then they have to work more in order to separate them. And these things so automatically connected rather than seen as individuals. So what do you think, Bina, are some of the maybe major macro level, policy level things that should be done?
Thank you. So I think the macro really link up, but I'm glad you brought the question back to the question of wealth and assets. In fact, I would like to put this to all my three fellow panelists, as well as to the audience, to ask, if you want to judge a man's economic status, do you only look at his job options? Why is it that we also talk about his wealth, his ownership of real estate? When Piketty wrote Capital in the 21st Century, he talked about inheritance issues, he talked about wealth. But somehow when we talk about women, we only see them as laborers in the labor market. And I feel this, that's important, but I think this really needs to change a perspective on what is the wealth status of women, what is the asset status of women. And I would strongly urge that we collect adequate data and we begin to talk about this much more. The second is that apart from the issue of types of jobs and non-traditional jobs, which I agree, one thing we haven't mentioned is the question of safety in the workplace. So if you take women in developing countries, why is it that they are less able to travel, even if there are jobs in the urban centers? Where will they stay? Is it safe to travel? Is it safety in the workplace itself? And there is new research showing that women, when they choose, do factor that in their job options. So we need to go much more in terms of infrastructure development in cities, in small towns, across the board, whether it is in developed or developing countries, and pay attention to that. The third thing, which I would say, Daniel, is both, when we think of micro and macro, we can think of when village people come together, we see it as micro, but when it expands, that still remains micro. So I'll give you two innovations, which I think it's important when we talk about G7 and G20, that we have a lot of cross-learning to do. So there are two things which I think have happened, especially in South Asia and particularly India, which I think are important to recognize. One is the emergence of self-help groups. Now, these are groups which are, the original institutional framework was microcredit. But in fact, the self-help groups are like people, need not be only women, of 8 or 10 who come together, do savings and credit. And then what India has done is they've linked it to banks. So if you've been a self-help group for 6 months, you can then apply for subsidized credit from, especially for rural areas, from banks. Can you guess how many self-help groups there are in India alone? The latest figures that I've seen are 12 million. So is this macro, is it micro? I don't think this is micro. This is actually huge scaling up. The second thing I want to emphasize is thinking outside the box, that we tend to think of jobs and assets as individual. And that's important in the sense that, that Charity talked about it. But then there are also ways in which we need to rethink this. And one of the most successful examples is what I hinted at in my earlier remarks, which is the emergence of group enterprises. Now, these showed themselves as being very effective during COVID, but coming back to agriculture, where still a vast majority of women certainly in the developing economies are based, is the question of, can they pool land, labor, and capital in order to do group farming? Now, this idea of group farming is actually not only limited to countries like India, but it's also found in France, which goes back to the 1960s. It's found in Norway, and in several countries. Now, in the Indian context, I actually compared all women's group farms to individual family farms, which are largely male managed, and looked at how well they perform. And I found that women's group farms had 1.8 times the annual value of output and 5 times per farm net profits compared to largely male managed individual family farms. So is this a model that we can actually look at? I believe we can. And as I said, in one state alone, there are 68,000 group farms. In France, some 21% of all farms today are group farms. There are different models, you're right, the context is different. In France, it's largely male farmers who've come together, it's largely in dairy, and they have somewhat different design principles and legal positions. And in the context of India, for instance, you have somewhat different contexts and design principles. But what is striking is that there is the similarities as well. And these models can be adapted, I believe, in many G20 countries, and also look at G7. I'll finally end by giving you one statistic. I was actually myself a bit startled by it. When I looked at some 86% of farms across 111 countries cultivate 2 hectares or less. And you would imagine most of these are developing country farms. But I found, in fact, that in the European Union, something like over 40% or 43% of farms are actually 2 hectares and less. So, these are farms are in Greece, in Italy, in Romania, and so on. So what I'm saying is that when we talk about cross-learning, we learn by extracting principles of institutional change which work, and then we adapt them to local contexts.
Yeah.
And that would be my strong plea to examine.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ibina. I really agree with the fact to look at the foundations and the context before adopting or transplanting particular approaches. So Beth, please, over to you.
Yeah, I want to mention the 2 approaches we need to strengthen to deal with climate change. One is mitigation, because it's coming. So but we don't want it to come too fast, right? So we want efforts to mitigate the climate change. And think about what we do at home, how we consume, and also how we produce. And Bina was talking about good farms. So how we produce, you could talk about good micro-enterprises as well. So mitigation both at home and in production. And the other, besides mitigation, is adaptation. That's how we can cope. How do we cope with what's coming and the planet? And think about where the future generation of adults will learn approaches towards mitigation and approaches towards adaptation. Schools don't yet teach those things right now. I don't think we have subjects that are called mitigation and adaptations approaches towards because of climate change. But parents can do that. And parents are the ones who actually teach, I think, being a parent myself, decision-making, risk-taking or risk aversion, conscientiousness, thinking about others, and so forth. And I think we have to go back to what populations are about, what countries are about. Families are very important. Households are very important. And women and girls in the future, will be doing 4/5 of caregiving in the family. Childcare, elder care, care for the sick, as well as all the home production that's done in the families. That's using time use data today and projecting it to what populations are going to be like in the future. So the role of the family is big, and the role of family is big for climate change. And I would have said gender growth, climate change for this session, because I think that that's sort of very much a part of the T7 agenda. So I would say that we need to think about policies that will stimulate the thinking or stimulate a change in behavior in families and also of producers to mitigate climate change. It's not all about climate finance, ladies and gentlemen. It's my feeling. A big part of the approach towards climate change has to be behavioral change. Behavioral change towards mitigation and behavioral change about adaptation, because it's coming. So, and those are things that we have to make sure that we communicate to individuals, to families, to communities, and we also do that to schools. So I would say because of the role of women in childcare, in child rearing, in the home, we have to make sure that this is an agenda that women actually accept and that women vote for, that women in their community work, in their volunteer work, because they do a lot of volunteering in communities, that this is something that they accept as the challenge of the future and that they have to prepare their children for climate change, not just climate friendly, but climate adaptive behaviors. So I would say we need to think about what can T7 and T20 do. We need more research. We need monitoring, first monitoring about what's happening with respect to climate change, but also how families and producers are behaving towards climate change. We need to think about how to improve climate-friendly behavior in families. We need laboratories, research laboratories. Data monitoring is not sufficient. We need to know how to change behaviors. And we can't do that without understanding cause and effect. And I would say the UN University that was talking about, the rector was talking about earlier, I would say research across the world, research in academia, in think tanks, need to think about trials, need to think about how to identify interventions, programs, policies that are going to do exactly this. Help families, help women, help communities to know how to mitigate climate change and how to adapt to what's coming. So that would be my plea for the T7 and T20. We need to know more about how can families adapt and also mitigate the risk of climate change.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So, thank you. So I want to spend the rest of the session, for questions and answers, because I know a lot of you have done a lot of work in this issue. You have research-based evidence. You have opinions. So I would ask you to introduce yourself, but keep it brief. One is this, and then Sitaram second. Please go ahead. And then maybe if you want to point to, which of the panelists you'd like to respond, or yeah, please go ahead.
I'm Ruby Pavankar, professor and medical doctor in Japan, and also I lead the Asia-Pacific Association of Allergy, Asthma, and Clinical Immunology. So I have two things. First, I'd like to talk about what Madam Hayashi actually mentioned about the changes in Japan. And I think I've seen it. I'm here 33 years. So I've seen the change that has occurred. I was involved with Prime Minister Abe's initiative on world empowerment of women. And I know that there was a keen interest during his time also for that. But one thing I would like to just highlight in that sense is that this issue of women, equity and parity, is not an issue of how economically developed a country is. See, even if you look at Switzerland, the women had voting rights only post-1970. Yep. When you look at places like India, I would say we are far better off in India in gender parity and equity. We have women leaders in all fields. We've had a prime minister ages back. Okay. We've had women at war.
Can you please get to your question?
Yes. So my point is that the basic thing of women should be about grassroots level. At the very basic grassroots of even the mindset, of changing the mindset of the men and the women, that the female generation, when they are brought up, they should know that there is parity. That kind of mindset, when they're growing up, this gives them the power and the capacity and the initiative that they can be on the same footing as men. All is based on hard work and results. Okay. It's not based on gender. And there's one more thing I'd like to quickly say, which, just 1 second, it's like related to climate change, which is very crucial. I think climate change, what Elizabeth has addressed, is really very important. Mm-hmm. And we are working in that space. And who is affected most is the women and the children are affected most. So climate mitigation and adaptation is crucial. Why? Because we all talk about how the war is a problem. We all talk about how economics should develop. Okay. And this I address also as a T20 member who's involved in the T20 aspect, that the T7 also has to take into consideration.
You need to wrap up because
yes,
we
I
give
will. I'm just coming to
others.
the point. T7 needs to take into consideration that climate change kills more people than the war. That's my final.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So Sitaram, you're next, please.
Thank you. This was an excellent panel, and one question which relates to the opening plenary yesterday, where Ms. Rena Jabbola and showed visibly with the pictures among the many challenges, still many women are not able to get to workplace because they still need to go and collect water and they don't have access to toilets. While this may look like solved problem in many places, but it is yet to be solved. So I want to ask this panel to share your views. There's a price to pay, and we have to pay for it. And accelerating the SDGs, to me, this seems like kind of a low-hanging fruit, but why is it that we are not prioritizing at this level? So I'd like to ask your views.
Great, thank you, Sitaram. Ambassador, please.
I'm Sujan Chinoy, the T20 chair for India. I particularly liked Beth's comments. You actually echoed what the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, has been suggesting by way of a lifestyle for the environment, which is to create pro-planet people, beginning with individuals and responsible consumption and behavior. And I think the role of women in this is particularly important because they, as mothers, are actually the first teachers. And they are the ones that mold and shape thinking. So I think this is a particularly opportune moment for societies like India and Japan are naturally inclined civilizationally to respect the environment. And so creating pro-planet people will come easier during the T7 presidency of Japan and the T20 presidency of India. I think that's a connect point. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ambassador. So Hayashi-san, Beth, Charity, Bina, who would like to make any response? Bina, please.
Yes, thank you. I think those are very good comments, and bringing us particularly to the question of climate change, where several comments and the question was there. I would say that women's importance in climate change, there are mothers, of course, but why should we only talk about women as mothers and their relationship with climate change? There are two other aspects which are absolutely key. One is women are farmers, and we know that climate change is going to affect crop yields, particularly negatively in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I believe here, therefore, the enabling women farmers to deal with these various aspects of climate. It's the weather, it's the absence of water and irrigation, the general infrastructure. And because increasingly more men move out of agriculture and women are left behind, I think we need to particularly get information to them on smart agriculture, on crops which bear extreme heat, and so on, rather than the point that Charity made, for instance, that you give the information to the men and hope it passes on to the women. So that's one part. The other is my own research on community forestry in India and Nepal showed that women, when they're involved in community forestry management, made a hugely significant positive difference to conservation outcomes, both in terms of tree cover and in terms of biodiversity improvement. And so I think the reminder that there is a very good link between gender and climate change is very important, but here it is women as workers and as direct interveners and protection of the environment would be the direction in which I think we should have much more discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bina. Does any of the panelists want to respond to Sitaram's question on why some low-hanging fruits haven't been solved? Please,
yeah,
yes.
Quick comment. Yes, so climate change is important issue for both men and women. That's what I now say. And the second thing, yes, we should prioritize the issues and from the viewpoint of well-being, including climate, including income disparity and gender. And so GDP is just one particular indicator to capture the economic performance. But the most important thing is the people's well-being, including, of course, people's happiness. What the policymakers should pursue. And yesterday, the State Minister for Foreign Affairs, Minister Yamada, mentioned we now face a historical turning point. That is the end of post-Cold War era. And I'd like to add one more thing. Another historical turning point, that is digitalization, that all the countries face at the moment. And my favorite words by Sir Winston Churchill, the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see. What we can learn from the history in the late 19th century and the 20th century, technological advancement leading to a structural change of economy and the society and income distribution of people. And some people got rich and others just dropped from the middle class and getting frustrated. That resulted in devastating politics and international order and catastrophic end of the tragedy. So that's what we learn from the history. So I'd like to put great emphasis on this change of the economy and the society and impact on our well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have one question online, and then we take one more from the floor if there's any.
We have one question from Professor Sultan Mahmoud from New Economic School. So it's a question to Professor Moore. The participant is curious to hear what are Professor Moore's thoughts, why there is so much heterogeneity in gender norms, even within societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Charity, please go ahead.
I think that's a very big question and a very good question. You know, I guess putting my economist hat on, I would think a lot of this comes down to both economic and factors that vary across countries and locations, but also the structure of households, right? And the ways in which individuals can cooperate together and how they've traditionally come together and cooperated together. I mean, I think the one thing I would say from my research as well is it's not just that gender norms differ, it's that they differ across individuals within households. Also, not just my own views might be different from, say, my spouse's views, but I may not even fully understand or internalize what someone else really thinks about gender norms. And, you know, we've done some research related to misperceptions of gender norms, and this has actually been important to disentangling whether women decide to participate in the labor force. You know, if they think their husband's against it, but he says he's not against it, they're actually still less likely to be participating. So, and then I guess the final thought is that, you know, these norms evolve clearly over time, and we've seen a lot of this happening. So I think if we think, you know, economies and societies are on better footing and households are on better footing when, you know, women and men are more equal, I think there's hope for that to happen because we've seen a lot of changes in that direction.
Great, thanks, Charity. Beth, please go ahead.
I just wanted to say that there are actually data that we can use already. There are, for example, Charity mentioned the World Values Survey, and we can end on a happy note because actually the World Values Survey indicate that people do change in terms of their opinions about and their views. And so I think that tells us that there's an opening for us to actually make changes about the way people live their lives, about how they work, to the point that Bina was making, that women are not just homemakers or not just caregivers, but also producers, which was where we started from. But there are data now that say that people do change. I mean, societies change their views about many things, and that that's something that we can act on. So that's a challenge to the G7, G20, and their corresponding think tanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Beth. So with that, I think we're right about at the time to finish. I would like to thank again our panelists, Hayashi-san, Beth, Charity, I'm sorry you have to stay very late, and Bina, thank you very much. So please join me in thanking them. And yes.
Thank you very much. And this concludes our morning session.